As many of you know, employment issues for English-speaking Quebecers have become more and more pressing over recent years. Last year, the Provincial Employment Roundtable published a series of 17 regional and one provincial employment profile that included the most recent available data on the employment situation of English speakers. Using data from the 2016 census, we concluded that English speakers in Quebec are facing considerable challenges in the labor market compared to their French-speaking counterparts. This includes higher unemployment rates and lower after-tax median incomes. So what does the census tell us now about the employment situation of English speakers? In 2021, Statistics Canada conducted its census of the population. The census, which is collected every 5 years, is the most comprehensive quantitative data, we have on the employment and socioeconomic status of Canada's official language communities. Today, I have the honor of presenting to you the most recent available data on the employment situation of Quebec's English-speaking communities. So before we dive into the data, I would be remiss to not give 3 important disclaimers, because you always have to, right, when you're talking about data. So firstly, the limited availability of linguistic data. Currently, the Quebec government does not collect employment data on linguistic minorities. We only have the federal census, which, as mentioned, is only collected every 5 years in the month of May. Secondly, the lack of detailed data on language within the census. The census collects linguistic data using several questions, such as an individual's first official language spoken and their knowledge of official languages. But these questions mostly ask about individuals' conversational ability. So this limits our knowledge about, people's language competency. So we don't know how well people read, write, their oral comprehension. All we know is how well can you conduct a conversation in French or English. And this is what we use to really understand the levels of competencies in the population. Lastly, the reliability of data for small communities. So many of you do come from small communities across Quebec. And in small communities, linguistic data becomes less reliable. And this really limits our ability to quantify the employment situation in these communities, really emphasizing the need for more research, more data, and particularly more qualitative research as well. So with that said, let's jump into the current data. So first we have population. Since 2016, the size of the English-speaking population in Quebec has grown. There are now over 1.25 million people in Quebec who identify English as their first official language spoken. This makes up 14.9% of the total population. Similarly, the workforce of English speakers has also expanded, totaling about 700,000 English speakers in the workforce, who represent 15.8% of Quebec's total labor force. So you can see here that English speakers represent a larger share of the labor force than they do the population. When we compare population in all of the regions, we can see that in Nord du Quebec, Montreal, and Laval, we see that there's higher population shares. In these regions, English speakers make up a significant portion of the total population, as well as a significant portion of the labor force. In Nord du Quebec, English speakers make up almost 60% of the population and over 55% of the labor force. And how do English speakers fare in terms of education? When we look at the education levels of English speakers, we find that they have high educational attainment levels in terms of secondary and post-secondary education. However, English speakers continue to have low levels of vocational education. Whereas 12.6% of French speakers have attained vocational education, so this is a very popular form of training in Quebec, only 5.6% of English speakers have vocational certificates. So these are trade jobs, right? Jobs that, are pretty high paying and are reliable. And so we can see that English speakers are not pursuing these vocational certificates at the same rate. And in fact, we can see that English speakers have lower rates of vocational education in every region across Quebec. Within English-speaking communities, the education levels vary. Generally, English speakers in regions that are far from English language post-secondary institutions tend to have lower post-secondary attainment. So we believe part of this is just a factor of distance, but there might be other factors influencing that as well. English speakers in Gaspésie, Île-de-la-Madeleine, Côte-Nord, and Nord de Québec have the lowest post-secondary attainment levels among English speakers in all of Quebec. In contrast, English speakers in the regions of Capitale-Nationale, Montreal, and Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean tend to have the highest post-secondary attainment levels. So let's move on to the labor force. How do English speakers participate in the labor force? English speakers have high levels of labor force participation. Roughly 66% of English speakers aged 15 and over are in Quebec's labor force and reported either having a job or looking for a job. This means that 2/3 of the English-speaking population are active in the labor force. This is higher than the labor force participation of French speakers, which is at 64%. When we break down the labor force participation by region, we can see that in 11 out of the 17 regions in Quebec, English speakers exhibit a higher rate of labor force participation compared to the French-speaking majority. Among these regions, Gaspésie-Île-de-la-Madeleine stands out with the lowest labor force participation rate amongst English speakers, which was recorded at 51.2% in May of 2021. English speakers also have low labor force participation in Abitibi-Témiscamingue, Mauricie, Bas-Saint-Laurent, and Côte-Nord. On the other hand, Laval emerges as the region with the highest labor force participation rate among English speakers in Quebec at 70.6%. This is followed by English speakers in Capitale-Nationale, who have a labor force participation rate of 68.9%, Chaudière-Appalaches with 68.5%, and Lanaudière with 67.2%. And where do English speakers work in Quebec? In 2021, healthcare was the province's top industry, as you can see to your left, with 14.2% of the total working population in this industry. However, professional, scientific, and technical services was the top industry for English speakers in Quebec, which attracted 11.4% of English-speaking workers. This professional, scientific, and technical service industry encompasses various fields, so it's a very broad category. It's important to understand that, so it can include legal services, engineering, computer systems design, scientific research, consulting, and one of the challenges with these categories is it's hard to really know what kind of jobs people are doing within these industries. But apart from this professional, scientific, and technical services industry, English-speaking workers also participate highly in retail, healthcare and social assistance, and then manufacturing. One interesting fact to note is that although healthcare and social assistance is the top industry with the largest number of staff shortages, only 10.3% of English-speaking workers were participating in this sector in 2021. And what about work activity? We know that, as of the most recent census, 50.3% of English speakers reported working full-time. This is a full 3% lower than the full-time work activity of the French-speaking majority. English speakers are also more likely to work part-time compared to French speakers and work a lower average number of weeks as well. So you can see here the average number of weeks for English speakers was 40 weeks compared to 41.7 weeks for French speakers. So now let's move over to the big one, unemployment. Although English speakers have high labor force participation, the most current data shows that they are facing considerable employment challenges. As of 2021, there were 75,913 unemployed English speakers across the province, representing an unemployment rate of 10.9%. This is a big jump from the previous census, where English speakers had an unemployment rate of 8.9%. Since the last census, the unemployment gap between French speakers and French speakers has increased to 4% from 2%. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this is pandemic level data. And this is probably one of the biggest questions that we've had with regards to working with this data set. And it is a challenge for us. In 2021, Canadians were facing the full onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, along with public health restrictions and work restrictions. This resulted in unemployment rates increasing across many communities across the country. However, what's interesting about the Quebec data is that the unemployment rate for French speakers in Quebec did not go up in May 2021. It remained stable at 6.9% in 2016 as well as in 2021, while the English-speaking unemployment rate did go up. This widening gap is worrisome, pointing to the relative labor market vulnerability of English-speaking Quebecers. When we examine the regional differences in unemployment, it becomes apparent that although English speakers in most regions are facing higher unemployment rates, there is a lot of regional variability in employment. English speakers in Gaspésie, Île-de-la-Madeleine, and Côte-Nord face the highest unemployment rates compared to other English speakers. In Gaspésie, the unemployment rate stands at 18.7%, while in Côte-Nord it is slightly lower, but still significant at 17.9%. These regions are experiencing significant economic challenges that are contributing to their higher unemployment rates. On the other hand, unemployment rates amongst French speakers tend to be relatively lower. In every region in Quebec except for Gaspésie, Île-de-la-Madeleine, French speakers had unemployment rates below 10%, indicating generally more favorable labor market conditions for French speakers. So who are these people, this 10% of English speakers who are unemployed? So we decided to dive a little deeper into this population. So just a caveat, there are many gaps in our understanding of this unemployed group, but what the census data tells us is that of the 75,900 unemployed English speakers, 60% of them live in Montreal, representing roughly 45,000 unemployed individuals. This is followed by Montérégie and Laval. And again, these are the regions where there is the highest concentration of English speakers, so it tracks, right, that there would be a higher amount of unemployed English speakers. But it is worth noting that there are unemployed English speakers across most regions of Quebec. When we look further at the visible minority status of these unemployed individuals, we see that although visible minorities represent 36% of the total English-speaking population, they represent a higher proportion of unemployed English speakers at 42.2%. Amongst non-visible minorities facing unemployment, the majority of them are South Asian, Black, or Chinese. Non-visible minority English speakers still represent the majority in this group at 57.8%. When we look at Indigenous identity, we find that 3.6% of unemployed English speakers also identified as Indigenous. I'll note here that because the census doesn't collect responses in certain Indigenous reserves and settlements, the unemployment rates for Indigenous individuals may not be wholly representative here. And what about these individuals' migrant status? We know that about 38.4% of unemployed English speakers identified as immigrants to Canada, and 77.6% of English speakers are non-permanent residents. So non-permanent residents here include individuals who have a study or work permit as well as refugees. And how much French do these individuals speak? Using the variable knowledge of official languages from the census, we find that a majority of unemployed English speakers in Quebec reported being able to conduct a conversation in French. So that's 62.3% of these unemployed individuals responded, yes, I can conduct a conversation in French. However, other research done by PERT has identified lack of French language skills as the leading barrier to employment for English speakers in Quebec, indicating the need for more research on French language competencies and employment outcomes. When we look at the work activity of these English speakers who face unemployment, we find that a significant portion of them, that is 59.4%, were working full-time before they became unemployed. So this question covers their employment period in the year previous. So previously they were working part-time, and then at the time of the census, they reported being unemployed. Only 7.1% of unemployed English speakers reported having worked full-time previously. Multiple studies have shown a strong correlation between part-time work and more labor market precarity for individuals. So this graph actually shows the occupation that unemployed English speakers previously worked in when they were employed. We can see that 43.1% of them had previously worked in sales and service occupations, followed by trades and transportation, then business, finance, and administration. Okay, so now that we've looked at the unemployment data, I'm going to zoom back out to the overall population data, and we're going to look at income. So the 2021 census data on income levels reveals that English speakers in Quebec earn lower median after-tax incomes compared to French speakers, as well as the total population. English speakers earn a median after-tax income of $34,000, which is $2,800 less than French speakers' median after-tax income, which was $36,800. When we examine employment income specifically, which is income received specifically from a job, this data reveals an even wider income gap. Whereas English speakers earned $32,000 in employment income on a median level, French speakers earned $37,200 in median employment income, indicating a $5,200 gap. Subsequently, we see a similar trend when we examine poverty rates. English speakers in Quebec now have a poverty rate of 10%, so that's 1 in 10 people, which is 4.2% higher than the poverty rate for French speakers. So here is a regional variation of the different incomes across a linguistic group, and we can see that English speakers have lower incomes than French speakers in 15 out of the 17 regions. The exceptions are Chaudière-Appalaches and Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, where English speakers generally earn more than French speakers. So this income data suggests significant income disparities between English and French speakers across Quebec. Furthermore, when considering after-tax and employment income gaps, Nord-du-Québec emerges as the region with the largest income disparities between English and French speakers. As we can see, English speakers earn $19,800 less in employment income compared to French speakers, and $5,600 less when we look at after-tax income. Lastly, how do we look at poverty rates across the different regions? So we know that English speakers have higher poverty rates than French speakers in 16 out of the 17 regions in the province. Several regions stand out with particularly high poverty rates amongst English speakers. In Mauricie, we can see that 13.3% of English speakers are living at or below the poverty level, followed closely by English speakers in Bas-Saint-Laurent at 13%, and English speakers living in Montreal at 12.6%. So how do we understand the census data? Employment poses a unique set of challenges and opportunities for Quebecers who speak English as their first official language. Our past research has shown that language skills play a significant role in how individuals experience the labor market and their employment outcomes. For English-speaking Quebecers, language and linguistic identity can function as a barrier to accessing and obtaining employment in a French language labor market. However, as you all know, there's more to this story than language, indicating the need for more research and knowledge work to build on the census data. And what does this data say about labor market precarity for English speakers? From this data, we can see that a higher proportion of English speakers in Quebec tend to be employed on a temporary and part-time basis compared to the French-speaking population. This is cause for concern, given that individuals in short-term, temporary work and part-time work are often more vulnerable to limited flexible work arrangements and reduced job security, which would have them less likely to be able to access permanent employment. In the past 2 decades, there have been notable increases in temporary and contract work in the Canadian labor market. This type of non-standard work tends to be more insecure than standard employment, often with fewer benefits and more uncertainty. The fact that a higher proportion of English speakers are engaging in temporary work and face higher unemployment rates adds to the vulnerability of the situation. Low compensation, a common element of non-standard work, is also considered a critical dimension of precarious employment. In most of Quebec's regions, English speakers have lower median incomes than French speakers, and the gaps are considerably wider when we compare employment income. This also suggests that in addition to facing higher uncertainty and lower job stability in the labor market, English speakers have a higher chance of being in precarious employment situations compared to their French-speaking counterparts. Lastly, what are the next steps? So PERT is currently developing 17 regional profiles and 1 provincial profile that will provide a comprehensive outlook on employment within English-speaking communities across Quebec. As part of this research, we have been conducting both quantitative and qualitative data collection through focus groups and analyzing the census data in order to develop profiles that will be released later this year. We look forward to continuing this discussion. And I will stop there. So thank you. I will now call up our Executive Director, Nicholas Salter.